So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Silas laughed as he poured the vintage Bordeaux over Margaret's hand in front of the entire dinner party. The dark, expensive liquid splashed against her pale skin and soaked into the white lace of the tablecloth, spreading like a fresh wound. For a moment, the only sound in the grand dining room of the Thorne estate was the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of the bottle hitting the rim of her crystal glass. "Oops," he sneered, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty that made the other guests shift uncomfortably in their velvet-backed chairs. "You're getting a bit slow in your old age, Mother. I thought you'd move your hand, but I suppose the reflexes aren't what they used to be." Margaret Thorne didn't flinch. She felt the cold, cloying stickiness of the wine seeping into her cuff, but she kept her spine pressed firmly against the mahogany chair. She didn't reach for a napkin. She didn't offer a humiliated gasp. Instead, she looked at her eldest son, noting the flush of arrogance in his cheeks and the way his designer watch caught the light of the crystal chandelier. He looked every bit the successful heir he believed himself to be. "It's a shame," Beatrice Thorne added, her voice a sharp contrast to the low hum of the air conditioning. Silas's wife leaned forward, the diamonds at her throat sparkling with a predatory light. "That lace was antique, wasn't it? Though I suppose it's like everything else in this house, fading, dusty, and well past its prime." Beatrice caught the eye of Claire Vance, a local socialite who had been eyeing the Thorne silver all evening. Claire offered a tight, sycophantic smile. The message was clear. The matriarch was no longer the queen of this castle. She was merely a relic waiting to be cleared away. "Speaking of things past their prime," Silas said, setting the bottle down with a heavy thud that rattled the silverware. He didn't look at his mother as he spoke to the table at large. "We've been reviewing the estate's portfolio. This house is far too large for a single woman who spends most of her time staring at the gardens. We've decided it's time to modernize. I've already contacted the developers for the north acreage." Margaret felt a sharp sting of outrage, but she buried it beneath a mask of practiced calm. The north acreage held the oak grove her late husband had planted for her. It was the heart of the estate. "The developers?" she asked, her voice steady and low. "Don't use that tone," he snapped, pointing a manicured finger at her. "You've lived on the Thorne legacy long enough without contributing a cent. Beatrice and I need the liquidity for the new firm. We've already picked out a lovely little assisted living suite in the city. It has a view of the park. You'll be much more comfortable there than rattling around in this mausoleum." A few seats down, Leo Thorne looked up from his plate, his fingers stained with the charcoal he used for his sketches. He looked as though he wanted to speak, his mouth opening slightly, but one sharp glance from Silas silenced him. Leo went back to pushing a pea around his plate, his shoulders slumped in the familiar posture of the defeated. Margaret glanced toward the end of the table, where Arthur Penhaligon sat. The family's longtime legal counsel and her husband's oldest friend remained silent, his eyes fixed on his wine glass. However, as Margaret's gaze met his, Arthur gave a microscopic nod. It was a flicker of movement, nearly invisible to anyone else, but it was the signal she had been waiting for. Underneath the damp lace of the tablecloth, Margaret's fingers brushed against the heavy vellum envelope she had tucked into her lap before the first course was served. The paper felt cool and substantial against her skin, a hidden weight of absolute authority. "You seem very certain of your position, Silas," she said softly. He laughed again, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "I'm the only one with the vision to lead this family, Mother. Father left the keys to the kingdom to the person who knew how to turn a profit. That's me. You're just the widow holding onto a ghost." Beatrice reached over and patted Margaret's hand, the gesture mockingly sympathetic. "It's for the best, dear. You really shouldn't have to worry about taxes and maintenance at your age. Let the professionals handle the heavy lifting." The smell of the lilies in the center of the table suddenly felt suffocating, their perfume cloying and thick like incense at a funeral. Margaret looked around the room, at the son who saw her as an obstacle, the daughter-in-law who saw her as a bank account, and the silent witnesses who were already imagining how they would spend her inheritance. She thought of the years she had spent playing the role of the quiet, grieving widow, letting them believe she was fading along with the wallpaper. She had let them grow fat on their own arrogance, watching as they signed contracts they hadn't read and made promises they couldn't keep. "I suppose you're right," Margaret said, finally picking up her napkin and dabbing at the wine on her hand with agonizing slowness. "Change is coming to this house, much sooner than you think." Silas smirked, signaling the server to bring the next course. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he didn't see the ice in his mother's eyes or the way Arthur was now checking his watch. "Good," Silas said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To the future of the Thorne estate, under new management." Margaret didn't raise her glass. She simply felt the edge of the envelope once more, her mind already counting down the hours until the morning. They thought they were attending a dinner to celebrate her exit. They had no idea they were sitting at the table of the woman who held their entire world in her hands. The game had officially begun, and Silas had just made his first and final mistake. The next morning, the smell of bitter espresso and floor wax permeated the air of the Thorne estate, a sharp contrast to the expensive vintage wine that had fueled Silas's arrogance the night before. Margaret Thorne sat in the high-backed leather chair of the library, her fingers tracing the cold, embossed crest on a manila envelope. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, until the heavy oak doors swung open with a violent thud. Silas stepped into the room, his silk robe billowing behind him like a conqueror's cape. He didn't look at his mother. Instead, he began pacing the perimeter of the library, tapping his knuckles against the spines of the rare first editions. "I've already spoken to the movers," he said, his voice cutting through the morning stillness with practiced indifference. "They'll be here on Thursday. I assume your personal effects will be packed by then. I'd hate for the staff to handle your more delicate items roughly." Margaret didn't flinch. She watched him, noting the way he avoided her gaze, his eyes already fixed on the portrait of his father hanging above the mantel. "Thursday is quite soon, Silas," she replied, her voice a low, steady hum. He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that grated against the quiet of the room. "Time waits for no one, Mother, especially not for those who have outlived their utility. I'm bringing in a design team on Friday. Beatrice wants to gut this room, too much dust and old lady energy, she says." He paused, finally looking at her with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You should be grateful. I'm letting you take the silver tea service. Consider it a parting gift for your years of supervision." The entitlement was a physical weight in the room, a rage-inducing display of a son who viewed his mother as an obstacle to be cleared. Margaret felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but she channeled it into the secret power resting beneath her palm. Inside the envelope was a document Silas had never seen, a private buyback agreement she had signed with the bank 6 months ago when Silas had nearly lost the estate to a gambling debt he thought he'd hidden. He believed he was inheriting a kingdom. He had no idea he was currently trespassing on her private property. The door opened again, and Leo Thorne drifted in, looking exhausted. He carried a small canvas, the colors vibrant and raw. "I heard the shouting," Leo murmured, setting the painting down on a side table. Silas didn't even wait for Leo to speak before he sneered. "And here is the court jester. Leo, tell me, does that paint-stained rag actually pay for your gin, or is Mother still subsidizing your genius?" He walked over and flicked the edge of the canvas with a disdainful finger. "It's sentimental trash. It goes in the bonfire with the rest of the clutter on Thursday." Leo's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Margaret, but Silas was already turning toward the window, dismissing them both. "Arthur Penhaligon is coming by at noon," Margaret said, her voice reclaiming the space. "He has the final paperwork regarding the transition of the Thorne assets." Silas didn't turn around. He leaned against the window frame, watching a hawk circle the grounds. "Good. Tell Arthur to bring the good pen. I want my signature to be bold on the documents that officially end your reign." He checked his gold watch, the sunlight glinting off the polished surface. "I've scheduled a gala for Friday night, a new era celebration. The entire board will be here, along with Claire Vance and the city's elite. It's only fitting they see the crown change hands in person. Margaret stood slowly, the silk of her dress whispering against the leather. She tucked the envelope into the drawer of the desk and locked it with a soft click. A gala. How very ambitious of you, Silas. I suppose a public event is exactly what this family needs. Exactly, Silas said, finally turning to face her, his chest puffed with unearned victory. Total transparency. Everyone will know exactly who holds the power in this house. Margaret met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I couldn't agree more. Friday night, then. I'll make sure everything is prepared for a reveal the Thorne family will never forget. As Silas marched out of the room, already barking orders into his phone, Margaret turned to Leo. She didn't say a word, but she reached out and straightened his painting on the table. The countdown had begun. 72 hours remained until Silas Thorne stood before his peers, and Margaret was going to make sure every single one of them watched as his world turned to ash. The following afternoon, the air in Arthur Penhaligon's private study smelled of aged mahogany and the sharp, clinical scent of fresh printer toner. It was a quiet, heavy atmosphere, punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a grandfather clock that had stood in the corner for 40 years. Margaret Thorne sat in a wingback leather chair, her spine perfectly straight, watching as her oldest friend sorted through a mountain of digital transcripts and physical ledgers. Arthur Penhaligon didn't look up immediately. He adjusted his spectacles, his fingers trembling slightly as he slid a thick manila folder across the desk toward her. I've called this the architect's ghost, he whispered, his voice raspy with a mixture of awe and disgust. Because that's what Silas has been doing. He's been building a phantom empire on the bones of your husband's legacy, Margaret. He thought he'd buried the trail deep enough that no one would ever look. She reached out, her gloved fingers brushing the cool, textured surface of the folder. Inside lay the culmination of 6 months of silent observation. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained: the offshore accounts, the forged signatures on the board resolutions, and the systematic siphoning of the Thorne Foundation's charitable funds into Silas's personal shell companies. Is it enough? She asked. Her voice was a low, steady hum in the quiet room. It's more than enough, he replied, leaning back. It's a total collapse. If this reaches the light of day, Silas won't just lose the company. He'll lose his freedom. The arrogance it took to leave these breadcrumbs. He truly believes you're too broken to fight back. The sudden, shrill vibration of a cell phone shattered the silence. Margaret glanced at the screen. Silas. She tapped the speakerphone button, her expression remaining as still as carved marble. Mother, where are you? Silas Thorne's voice boomed through the office, dripping with the impatient entitlement of a man who viewed the world as his personal waiting room. I'm at the estate with the event planners, and the floral arrangements you picked are an embarrassment. They look like something for a funeral, not a triumph. I've had them sent back. From now on, stay out of the way. I've given Beatrice full control over the aesthetic. Try not to embarrass us by wandering into the foyer while the caterers are working. I see, she said, her eyes meeting Arthur's. You've made your preferences very clear, Silas. Good, and for heaven's sake, buy a new dress, something that doesn't scream widow. This gala is about the future of the Thorne name, not a lingering attachment to the past. I'll see you at dinner, don't be late. The line went dead with a dismissive click. Arthur shook his head, a grimace tightening his features. He speaks to you like a servant. He speaks to me like a man who thinks he's already won, she corrected softly. She stood up, tucking the folder into her handbag. Let him have his flowers and his finery. The higher he builds his pedestal, the more spectacular the fall will be. 2 hours later, the biting chill of a high-end boutique's air conditioning greeted her as she stepped inside. The shop was a shrine to excess, all glass and gold leaf, where the scent of expensive lilies was so thick it was almost suffocating. She saw her daughter-in-law before the other woman saw her. Beatrice Thorne was standing in the center of the showroom, draped in a shimmering emerald gown that likely cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Beatrice was currently berating a young sales assistant, her voice carrying across the polished floors. I told you, the hem is a 1/4 inch off. Do you have any idea who I am? This dress is for the Thorne Gala. If it isn't perfect, I'll make sure you never work in this zip code again. Margaret approached slowly, her heels clicking with deliberate precision on the marble. Beatrice turned, her eyes raking over Margaret's simple, charcoal gray suit with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "Oh, Margaret," Beatrice sneered, waving a manicured hand toward the racks. "I didn't expect to see you here. I suppose Silas told you that your current wardrobe is lacking. But really, dear, don't bother with the couture. At your age, and with your, shall we say, diminished status, something off the rack would be much more appropriate. We wouldn't want people thinking you're trying too hard to hold onto the glory days." The sales assistant looked down, her face flushed with humiliation. Margaret didn't flinch. She stepped closer, the scent of Beatrice's cloying, expensive perfume filling the space between them. "The glory days, as you call them, were built on substance, Beatrice," Margaret said, her voice like a velvet glove over a steel fist. "Not just silk and social climbing. I hope that dress is comfortable. You'll want something you can move in when the floor starts to shift." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Always so cryptic. It's a shame, really. You could have just retired gracefully. Instead, you're lurking around like a ghost in your own home. Just remember, Friday night is Silas's moment. Try to stay in the shadows where you belong." Margaret watched as Beatrice turned back to the mirror, preening and adjusting the emerald fabric, utterly consumed by her own reflection. She felt the weight of the folder in her bag, a secret power that thrummed against her side. 48 hours remained. She walked out of the boutique without buying a single thing. She didn't need a new dress to attend a reckoning. As she stepped back into the late afternoon sun, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Arthur Penhaligon. "Everything is in place. Ensure the media contacts are ready for the Friday night release. No survivors." She looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers of the city, the empire Silas thought he had stolen. The countdown wasn't just ticking in her head anymore. It was echoing in the very foundations of the family name. Silas and Beatrice were busy polishing the silver, never realizing that the house was already on fire. The day before the Thorne Foundation's centennial gala, the air in the estate was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the sharp tang of floor wax. Margaret Thorne stood in the doorway of the grand library, watching Silas Thorne as he swirled a glass of 20-year-old scotch. The amber liquid caught the light of the dying afternoon, reflecting the same cold fire she saw in his eyes. "You're still here," he said, not looking up from the ledger on the mahogany desk. His voice held the casual cruelty of a man who believed he had already won. "I expected you to be halfway back to your little garden by now. The gala is a high-stakes environment, Margaret. It's not for the fragile." She walked further into the room, her heels silent on the Persian rug. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Silas. 100 years of history is a long time. It would be a shame to see it end in a single night." He finally looked up, a smirk twisting his features. This was the man who had forged her signature and drained the trust accounts, yet he sat there with the posture of a king. "And the Thorne name is stronger than ever. I've secured the Vance merger. By tomorrow night, we'll be untouchable. You should be grateful I'm letting you sit at the head table. It keeps up appearances." Margaret reached out, her fingers grazing the cold brass of a letter opener on the desk. She felt the sharp edge, a tactile reminder of the blade she was about to twist. Appearances can be so deceptive. You think you've built a fortress, but you've really just built a very expensive cage. Silas laughed, a dry, rasping sound that set her teeth on edge. "And what are you going to do? Scold me? You're a relic, Margaret, a ghost haunting a house that belongs to me now. If you cause a scene tomorrow, I'll have security escort you out before the first course is served. Don't test my patience. Your monthly stipend depends entirely on your silence." The door creaked open, and Leo Thorne stepped in looking frayed. He held a stack of seating charts, his hands trembling slightly. "The caterers need the final count, Silas, and Beatrice is demanding the floral arrangements be changed again." Silas didn't even look at his brother. He just snapped his fingers toward the desk. "Put them there and deal with it, Leo. and tell your sister-in-law to stop whining. If she wants to be the queen of the evening, she needs to act like she's been in a ballroom before." Leo flinched, his gaze darting to Margaret. He caught the steady, unyielding look in her eyes, a sharp contrast to the hollow arrogance of the man behind the desk. For a second, a flicker of realization crossed his face, a silent recognition that the power dynamic in the room wasn't what it seemed. "Is that all?" Leo asked, his voice tighter than usual. "Get out!" Silas dismissed him with a wave of his hand. As the door clicked shut, he turned back to Margaret. "See, even your favorites know who holds the leash. You have nothing left but memories, and memories don't hold voting rights." Margaret leaned down, her face inches from his. The smell of the scotch was overwhelming now, the scent of a man drowning in his own ego. "Tomorrow night, when the clock strikes 10, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that I gave you every chance to walk away with your dignity." Silas didn't flinch. He simply took a long, slow sip of his drink. "I'll be too busy accepting the keys to the city to remember anything you say. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an empire to run." She turned and walked out, the weight of the secret folder in her mind feeling heavier than any physical burden. As she reached the hallway, her phone buzzed. A message from Arthur Penhaligon appeared. "The digital trail is locked. The press release is queued for 10:15 p.m. The Vances have already received the anonymous tip regarding the embezzlement. The trap is set." Margaret looked at the portrait of the Thorne patriarch hanging in the hall. The eyes seemed to follow her, expectant. 24 hours. The countdown wasn't just a ticking clock anymore. It was the sound of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. Silas was so busy admiring the view from the top that he hadn't noticed the ground had already vanished beneath him. The following morning, the mahogany-paneled courtroom of Judge Halloway felt less like a hall of justice and more like a stage for a public execution. Margaret Thorne sat at the petitioner's table, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the plush green leather of the chair. She could smell the faint, cloying scent of floor wax and the metallic tang of old radiator heat, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the Thorne estate. Beside her, Arthur Penhaligon adjusted his spectacles, his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't look like a man about to dismantle a dynasty. He looked like a librarian preparing to shelve a particularly dusty volume. Silas Thorne sat 10 feet away, radiating the kind of oily confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. He leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, his expensive silk suit catching the light of the overhead chandeliers. He looked every bit the grieving, concerned son, but Margaret saw the way his fingers drummed a restless, greedy rhythm on the tabletop. He was already spending the money she hadn't even lost yet. "You look tired, Mother," Silas said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the court reporter. He didn't wait for her to respond, his gaze sweeping over her modest charcoal suit with visible disdain. "This process is grueling. If you just signed the voluntary papers, we could have been at the club by noon. You're only making this harder on your health." Margaret didn't flinch. She met his eyes, her own as cold as a winter Atlantic. "My health is quite robust, Silas. It's my patience that's wearing thin." The door at the back of the room swung open, and Beatrice Thorne slipped in, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was draped in a trench coat that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her face a mask of practiced, tragic sympathy. She took a seat behind Silas, reaching forward to squeeze his shoulder. The scent of her heavy, rose-heavy perfume began to fill the small space, an intrusive, suffocating floral cloud. She caught Margaret's eye and gave a small, condescending tilt of her head, the kind one might give a failing pet. "All rise," the bailiff droned. Judge Halloway, a woman who looked as though she'd been carved from the same mahogany as her bench, took her seat. "We are here for the matter of the emergency temporary guardianship of Margaret Thorne, petitioned by Silas Thorne. Counsel, proceed." Silas's attorney stood, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He spoke of concerning lapses in judgment, of unexplained financial transfers, and the tragic decline of a once brilliant mind. He presented a series of documents, Affidavits from household staff Silas had likely bribed, detailing instances where Margaret had supposedly forgotten her keys or misplaced important files. "It is a matter of protection," the attorney concluded, casting a pitying look toward Margaret. "The Thorne estate is a pillar of this community. We cannot allow it to be dismantled by the confusion of a woman who no longer understands the value of what she holds." Confusion. Arthur Penhaligon's voice was a quiet thunder as he stood. "Your Honor, my client is many things, but confused is not among them." Silas let out a short, sharp huff of a laugh. "She tried to fire the entire board of the foundation last week, Arthur. If that isn't a sign of a break from reality, I don't know what is." He turned to the judge, his expression shifting into one of earnest, pained sincerity. "Your Honor, I love my mother, but she's paranoid. She's seeing enemies where there are only family members trying to help. She's even started hiding legal documents in her private residence, refusing to let the family office audit the accounts. It's for her own safety that I take the reins." Margaret felt the weight of the secret folder in her mind, the digital trail Arthur had locked down the night before. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of her smartphone. Beneath the table, she felt the steady vibration of a notification. 10:15 p.m. was still hours away, but the preliminary tremors were starting. "Is it paranoia, Silas?" Margaret asked, her voice steady and clear. "Or is it simply that I finally started looking at the ledgers myself?" Silas's face darkened, a flash of genuine rage breaking through his polished exterior. "You wouldn't know a ledger from a cookbook, Mother. You've spent 40 years hosting galas while Father and I built this empire. You're out of your depth, and your refusal to admit it is putting everything we've worked for at risk." Beatrice leaned forward, her voice a sharp stage whisper. "Silas is right, Margaret. You're acting like a child. It's embarrassing for everyone. Think of Leo. Think of the Thorne name." Leo Thorne sat in the back row, his face pale, his eyes darting between his mother and his brother. He looked like a man caught between a sinking ship and a shark. He caught Margaret's gaze for a fleeting second before looking down at his boots, his silence a heavy, disappointing weight in the room. "I am thinking of the Thorne name," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "That's exactly why we're here." Arthur Penhaligon cleared his throat, drawing the judge's attention. "Your Honor, before we proceed with the medical testimony the petitioner has arranged, I would like to introduce a new set of exhibits. These are certified bank records from the Vance holdings, which were delivered to my office just an hour ago." Silas froze. The smug tilt of his head vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid stillness. He glanced at Beatrice, whose eyes had gone wide and frantic. "The Vance holdings." Silas stammered, his voice losing its baritone richness. "What do they have to do with a guardianship hearing?" "Everything," Arthur said, handing a packet to the bailiff. "Because these records show a series of anonymous transfers totaling $6 million, routed through a shell company registered to a certain Silas Thorne. Transfers that coincide exactly with the dates my client is accused of being confused about her finances." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the frantic, shallow breathing of Beatrice Thorne. Margaret took a slow sip of the lukewarm water from the plastic cup on her table, the taste flat and unremarkable. She watched as the color began to drain from Silas's neck, a slow, creeping pallor that climbed toward his jawline. Judge Halloway flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. She looked up, her gaze pinning Silas to his chair. "Mr. Thorne, your attorney mentioned unexplained financial transfers. I believe we've found them." "This is a fabrication," Silas hissed, his hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white. "She's using her connections to smear me. This has nothing to do with her mental capacity." "On the contrary," Margaret said, standing slowly. She didn't look frail. She didn't look tired. She looked like the owner of the room. "It has everything to do with my capacity to see exactly who you are, Silas. You didn't want a guardian for me. You wanted a shroud for your thefts." She turned toward the door, nodding to Arthur. The trap was no longer just set. The teeth had begun to close. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice ringing with a new, sharp authority. In light of this evidence, we move not only for the dismissal of this petition, but for an immediate freeze on all of the petitioner's access to Thorne assets pending a criminal investigation. Silas stood up, his chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. You can't do this. I am the CEO. I am the heir. You are a guest in my house, Silas, Margaret said, her voice like a closing door. And your stay has just been revoked. As she walked toward the exit, her phone buzzed again. A text from Claire Vance. The board has seen the records. The press is outside. The empire is falling, Margaret, just like you promised. Margaret stepped into the hallway, the cool air hitting her face like a benediction. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of Silas shouting and the judge's gavel slamming down, a rhythmic, final thud that sounded exactly like a coffin being nailed shut. She didn't look back. The countdown to 10:15 p.m. was no longer a threat. It was a victory march. The rain had started just as Margaret Thorne reached the glass and steel monolith of the Thorne building. The scent of wet pavement and ozone followed her into the lobby, a sharp contrast to the cloying, artificial fragrance of lilies that always choked the entryway. She didn't stop at the security desk. She didn't have to. The guards, men who had spent years bowing to her son's whims, stepped aside with a synchronized, silent deference that felt like the first real breath of air she'd taken in a decade. Mother, stop right there. The voice echoed off the vaulted marble ceilings, jagged and desperate. Silas Thorne was sprinting across the lobby, his silk tie loosened and his hair plastered to his forehead. Behind him, Beatrice Thorne struggled to keep pace, her designer heels clicking frantically against the stone like the heartbeat of a panicked animal. They weren't alone. Claire Vance stood near the elevators with 3 other board members, their faces grim, while a cluster of reporters, tipped off by the morning's court disaster, surged forward with cameras raised. Silas reached her first, his hand darting out to grab her arm, but he stopped short when Arthur Penhaligon stepped into his path. The lawyer didn't say a word. He simply adjusted his spectacles, his presence a silent, legal wall. This is a stunt, Margaret, Silas hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer mask. A temporary freeze is not a coup. I am the CEO of this company. This building, every floor of it, belongs to me by right of succession. You're a ghost in a house I built. Beatrice stepped up beside him, her eyes darting to the cameras. Think about the scandal, Margaret. You're destroying the family name for a grudge. Have you no dignity left? Margaret didn't flinch. She looked past them to where Leo Thorne stood near the glass doors, watching the scene with a newfound, steady clarity. She turned her gaze back to Silas, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. You've always been so focused on the heights, Silas, she said, her voice carrying easily through the hushed lobby. The corner office, the penthouse, the view from the top. You forgot to look at what was beneath your feet. She reached into Arthur's briefcase and pulled out a single, heavy vellum folder. She didn't hand it to Silas. She walked over to the lobby's central directory, a massive digital display, and nodded to Claire Vance. With a crisp motion, Claire swiped a keycard, and the screen flickered, replacing the corporate logo with a high-resolution scan of a land deed dated 30 years ago. The Thorne building sits on prime real estate, Margaret said, her tone conversational. But the Thorne Corporation never owned the land. My husband held it in a private trust, separate from the company assets, a trust that passed entirely to me upon his death. The blood didn't just leave Silas's face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a gray, parchment-like mask of disbelief. His jaw didn't drop. It hung slack, a jagged tremor seizing his lower lip as his breath hitched in audible, wet rattles. His eyes, once sharp with predatory greed, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the digital display as if the ink might magically rearrange itself into a lie he could survive. A single bead of sweat tracked a path through his foundation, carving a visible line of ruin down his cheek, while his hands, usually so steady when signing away lives, clawed uselessly at the air. He looked smaller, the expensive tailoring of his suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for the hollowed-out man inside it. The silence in the lobby was absolute, broken only by the rapid-fire clicking of the reporters' shutters. Claire Vance stepped forward, her voice ringing with professional finality. As the owner of the land, Mrs. Thorne has issued a formal notice of lease termination for the corporation's headquarters, effective immediately. Furthermore, the board has just voted. Silas, you are removed from your position for gross financial negligence and the endangerment of corporate stability. Beatrice let out a sharp, choked sound and stepped back, her hand flying to her throat as she physically distanced herself from the man she had championed only seconds before. Margaret stepped closer to Silas, leaning in until she could smell the sour scent of his defeat. You spent 30 years trying to step into your father's shoes, Silas, she whispered, cold as a winter grave. You never noticed I was the one who owned the floor you were standing on. She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't need to hear the excuses or the begging that she knew would follow. Margaret turned on her heel, her coat billowing behind her like a shroud. As she walked toward the rain-slicked street, she heard the first reporter shout a question, the sound of the pack finally closing in on the wounded king. She stepped into the cool afternoon air, the weight of the Thorne empire falling away behind her, leaving nothing but the sweet, sharp clarity of the storm. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi were a rhythmic, blinding pulse against the glass doors of the Thorne Plaza, but inside the ballroom, the silence was far more deafening. Margaret Thorne had already stepped into the cool night air, leaving a vacuum of shock that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the gilded room. Silas Thorne stood paralyzed at the center of the marble floor, his fingers twitching against the silk of his lapels. The arrogant flush that had defined his face for decades didn't just fade, it curdled. His skin took on the gray, waxy hue of a man watching his own execution, his jaw hanging slack as if the muscles had simply given up. His eyes, once sharp with predatory greed, darted frantically around the room, finding no refuge, only the cold, mirrored reflection of his own ruin. He looked suddenly, pathetically small, the expensive tailoring of his suit appearing 3 sizes too large for a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. A thin bead of sweat broke across his forehead, shimmering under the harsh chandeliers, while his breathing came in shallow, jagged hitches that whistled in the quiet. "This is a lie," he croaked, though the sound lacked even a shred of conviction. He looked toward the head of the board, searching for a nod, a smile, any sign of the fealty he had commanded an hour ago. Arthur Penhaligon stepped forward, his expression as unyielding as a tombstone. He didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. Instead, he placed a heavy, leather-bound folder onto the podium Margaret had just vacated. The thud of the paper against wood sounded like a gavel. "The filings are original, Silas," Arthur said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "The trust was never yours to dissolve. Margaret didn't just retain her shares. She spent the last 3 years quietly absorbing the debt you hidden in the shell companies. She owns your seat. She owns this building. And as of 4 minutes ago, the board has received a formal injunction freezing every account associated with the Thorne name." The shift in the room was physical. Beatrice Thorne didn't reach for her husband's hand. She took a deliberate step back, her eyes raking over him with a sudden, sharp disgust, as if he were a stained garment she could no longer afford to wear. She adjusted her diamond necklace, her face a mask of cold calculation as she began to scan the room for an exit, or perhaps a more stable ally. Leo Thorne stood near the buffet, his charcoal-stained fingers trembling. He watched the man he had feared his entire life collapse into a heap of expensive wool and desperation. For the first time, the shadow of his father didn't look like a mountain. It looked like a grave. "Silas!" Claire Vance's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and predatory. The city's most influential socialite was already holding her phone aloft, the screen glowing as she updated her column in real time. "Is it true? Are the creditors already at the estate? Get out!" he hissed at her, but the command had no teeth. The board members who had been laughing at his jokes minutes ago were now physically distancing themselves, creating a literal circle of isolation. The smell of stale champagne and expensive lilies suddenly felt cloying, like the scent of a funeral. Silas lunged for the folder Arthur had placed on the podium, his movements clumsy and frantic. He tore through the pages, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, looking for the loophole that had always been there before. But there were no holes this time. Every signature was verified, every transfer was tracked. The trap hadn't been sprung tonight, it had been built brick by brick over years of his own overconfidence. "She can't do this," he whispered, looking at Arthur. "I'm his son. I'm the heir." "You were the steward, Silas," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of pity. "And you were a poor one. You were so busy measuring the height of the throne that you forgot who built the floor." The heavy brass doors at the back of the hall swung open. Two men in dark, understated suits entered. They didn't look like guests. They moved with the grim, methodical purpose of people who were paid to remove trash. Silas watched them approach, his knees finally buckling. He sank into a chair, the very chair he had used to hold court all evening. He looked at Beatrice, a silent plea for help in his eyes, but she had already turned her back, deep in a hushed, frantic conversation with her lawyer. The security team reached him. There was no shouting, no dramatic struggle. There was only the quiet, firm pressure of a hand on his elbow and the low murmur of a directive. "Mr. Thorne, you need to come with us. Your personal items will be forwarded to a temporary address." As they led him toward the service exit, the same one the waiters used, the crowd parted like a receding tide. No one reached out. No one offered a word of support. The silence followed him, heavy and judgmental, until the doors clicked shut behind him. In the sudden vacuum of his absence, the party didn't stop. It simply pivoted. Claire Vance signaled for more champagne, and the board members huddled around Arthur Penhaligon, their voices rising in a frantic chorus of new allegiances. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Margaret sat in the back of her car, watching the lights of the Thorne Plaza shrink in the rearview mirror. She felt no rush of adrenaline, no heat of anger. There was only a profound, cooling clarity. She opened her purse and pulled out a small, silver-framed photograph of her late husband. She ran a thumb over the glass, then tucked it away. The debt was paid, but the ledger of her life was now dangerously empty. She signaled the driver to move, leaving the wreckage of her family's ego behind her, but as the car turned the corner, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "It's done, but you should check the safe in the study." He wasn't the only one keeping secrets. 6 months had passed since the night the glass shattered at Thorne Plaza, and the world had grown remarkably quiet. Margaret Thorne sat on the terrace of the estate Edward had built for them, the one Silas had tried to list for auction while her husband's body was still warm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint, spicy aroma of blooming chrysanthemums. She sipped her tea, the fine bone china warm against her palms, and watched the rhythmic movement of garden shears as a groundskeeper trimmed the hedges. The peace was interrupted by the crunch of gravel. Arthur Penhaligon walked up the path, his leather briefcase looking thinner than it had during the months of litigation. He took the seat opposite her, declining tea with a weary smile. "It's finalized," Arthur said, placing a single blue folder on the table. "The last of the offshore accounts have been rolled into the foundation. Silas Thorne is officially disconnected from every asset bearing the Thorne name. He signed the final waiver yesterday." Margaret didn't feel the rush of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound sense of relief, like a fever finally breaking. "How did he look, Arthur?" "Smaller," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of pity. "He's living in a studio apartment in the East End, one of those cramped walk-ups he used to call slums for the uninspired. He's working as a junior researcher for a mid-sized firm. Ironically, the man who hired him is someone Silas fired for lack of vision 5 years ago. Life has a way of balancing the scales." Margaret looked out over the lawn. The fall of Silas had been swift. Once the board members, led by a frantic Claire Vance, realized the depth of his embezzlement, they had turned on him like a pack of wolves. Beatrice Thorne had been the first to flee. The moment the judge froze Silas's personal accounts, she had filed for divorce, claiming she was a victim of his financial deception. She was currently attempting to sell her story to a tabloid, though without the Thorne jewels to wear for the photo shoot, the interest was dwindling. "He sent this," Arthur added, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "I told him I wouldn't deliver it, but he insisted it was a legal matter." Margaret opened the note. It wasn't a legal document. In Silas's familiar, arrogant scrawl, he had written, "You think you've won, but you've only proven you're as cold as the rest of us. I was the only one who actually kept this family relevant. Enjoy your empty house." Margaret felt a familiar spark of heat, a final rage spike at the sheer audacity of his victimhood, but it faded quickly. He was still trying to gaslight her from the gutter. She set the note down. He still doesn't understand. It was never about relevance. It was about honor. "Speaking of the family," Arthur said, nodding toward the far end of the garden. Leo Thorne emerged from the stone conservatory, his hands stained with charcoal and oil. He didn't look like the pampered, indecisive boy who had once let Silas bully him into silence. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He had refused his mother's offer of a full inheritance, choosing instead to work for the Foundation's arts program while he finished his own portfolio. He waved at them, a small, tentative gesture of a bridge being rebuilt stone by stone. "He's getting better," Margaret whispered. "He is," Arthur agreed, "but there's still the matter of the safe." Margaret stood, her silk skirts whispering against the stone. She led Arthur into the mahogany-paneled study. The air here smelled of old paper and the lingering ghost of Edward's pipe tobacco. She walked to the portrait of her late husband and swung it aside, revealing the hidden wall safe mentioned in the mysterious text she'd received the night of the gala. She turned the dial, the clicks echoing in the silent room. When the heavy door swung open, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. There was only a single, silver-framed photograph and a thick, handwritten ledger. Margaret pulled the ledger out, her fingers trembling as she recognized Edward's handwriting. As she flipped through the pages, the cost of her victory finally settled in her chest. Edward had known. For the last 3 years of his life, he had tracked Silas's thefts. He had documented every lie, every forged signature, and every betrayal. He hadn't kept the secret to protect Silas. He had kept it to protect Margaret, knowing that if the truth came out while he was dying, she would have been destroyed by the grief of it. The final page contained a letter addressed to her. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means Silas has finally crossed the line I hoped he never would. I am sorry I had to leave you this burden, but I knew you were the only one strong enough to save the name from the man our son became." Margaret closed the book, the heavy thud sounding like a gavel. She had her house, her fortune, and her dignity. But the image of Edward sitting in this very chair, dying and knowing his only son was a thief, was a weight she would carry forever. She looked at the photograph in the safe, a picture of a young Silas, barely 5 years old, sitting on Edward's shoulders. They were both laughing, eyes bright with a future that had never come to pass. Margaret reached in and touched the cold brass key to the safe. Then slowly, she closed the door, locking the memory away. The debt was paid, the ledger was closed, and for the first time in decades, Margaret Thorne walked out of the room and into the light of a world that was entirely her own.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.